Thank you. Thanks for having me here today. I'm Rob Spirko, he, him pronouns. I'd better get out my timer. I'm a nerd, and I will talk about this stuff. So here's the thing. I stand before you today as a prophet. Now, that may sound a little conceited. I realize that the real subtitle of this talk should be, how I became a prophet, and you can too. But then I realized that prophethood is not really a good MLM scheme. It doesn't really. But here's the thing. Every year in my house, Easter, Passover time, we watch the Ten Commandments. And over the course of that movie, you can watch as Charlton Heston's hair gets bigger, his beard gets fuller, so by the time he's parting the Red Sea, you are like, dang, that is a prophet. Right. So the beard helps. But the thing about Unitarian Universalism is we do not require beards for prophethood. Right. If you look in our sources, right, the prophetic voices of prophetic people. Right. So where does prophecy come from? Right. James Luther Adams, who was a Unitarian Universalist theologian in the 20th century, said that prophecy is about people coming together, actually, right, to foresee he used the phrase, their common doom, which is epic sounding, but really means what's going on, to take the measure of the time, to see how things are changing, right. He says that what the Protestant Reformation introduced was the idea of the priesthood of all believers, right? That every person had a direct connection to the divine. You didn't need intermediaries, right? And what he wanted to offer is the prophethood of all believers, right? That we could come together. The Unitarian Universalist faith is interesting in that we put a great value in the individual conscience, the individual search for truth and meaning, right? But if you look around, there are other people in the sanctuary today, right? We have this collective too, right? We have democratic processes, right? We believe in the group and the covenant. You don't have a covenant by yourself, right? Covenants imply groups of people. And what Adams, I think, was trying to do was sort of hit that, like the individual discernment, right, plus the power that comes when you gather together and bring all that into a group, right? We think of the biblical prophets, the Jeremiahs, right, the Hoseas, all those. And I'm teaching a class, again, nerd here, on the prophetic mode in African American literature this semester. I've been thinking about it. And it seems to me, my contention, and I've told my students to read what we're reading and check and see if they think this is true, right? The prophecy starts in critique and ends in hope. I'm delighted that you had the hope song. It starts in lamentation and ends in restoration, in transformation, reconciliation, resurrection, whatever word you want to use there, right? And I felt like my students, especially these days, really need that, right? The critique is easy to see around us now. Things that need critique, things that need criticism, things that need to be different, right? But I think that the harder thing to hold on to is that hope. Where do we go? What is the beloved community look like, right? So of course my ears picked up when Representative Justin Pearson, right, on the moment of him getting expelled from the state legislature, used the word prophecy. I'm like, hot diggity, I can talk about this in class and it's okay now. He said resurrection is a promise and a prophecy. He said this both on the floor of the Tennessee State Legislature and then a couple of days later in the sanctuary at the Church of the River, the Unitarian Universalist Church, that his father, as the Disciples of Christ minister, has a relationship with, right? He said resurrection is a promise and a prophecy that came out of the cotton fields, a prophecy that came out of the lynching tree, and that still lives in each and every one of us, he said. And for me, at that moment, right, him coming from his Disciples of Christ background and us as UUs were fundamentally in alignment, right? But you can see it starts in lamentation and ends in hope, right? So how does that relate to Article 2? That's what I'm supposed to be talking about today. In several ways, right? Because we live in a changing time, right? And if Adam says that prophecy comes out of people understanding the changes, right? And then using that to, as he says, to shape history and not get shoved around by it, right? That's what I think we want, right? We want to build the beloved community and to shape that history. What will get us there? What are the changes we're going through? I just want to remind people, 9 years ago, Michael Brown was shot near St. Louis, Missouri. And what followed was a refusal, first by the black community there and in larger and larger circles, to not accept business as usual and to say Black Lives Matter. Right? And then 3 years ago, George Floyd was killed by a police officer, touching off another intense round of protest. But also, 12 years ago, right, people in Zuccotti Park in New York occupied Wall Street, right? They called out greed and extractive corporate capitalism, and within a year or two, the movement had spread to protest in 951 cities across 82 countries. Right? And commentators disagree about the ultimate effect of that movement, but I guarantee you everybody is aware of a phrase that they originated, which is the 1%. Right? But also 5 years ago, 15-year-old Greta Thunberg started spending her days outside the Swedish parliament by herself, holding a sign that said, "School strike for climate." A year later, she was saying very bluntly to the leaders of the world gathered at the UN Climate Action Summit, "How dare you? How dare you continue to look away and come here saying that you're doing enough when the politics and solutions needed are still nowhere in sight? You are failing us." She said it to their faces. So there are lots of places that this started, right, our moment. I can't ignore the fact that 6 years ago, the United States elected a president who saw that arc bending toward justice and then grabbed a hammer and tried to knock that sucker flat, right? But let's not forget, the day after that inauguration, we saw the largest single-day protest in U.S. history, the Women's March. 400,000 people in Washington, D.C., 4 million across the U.S., 7 million across the world. Right? All of these movements are not moments of beginning, but renewal. Right? They come out of movements before and movements before that. Unitarian Universalists were involved in all of those and were affected by them. Right? We have seen grassroots campaigns to change things in our principles and sources. There was a move to expand the first principle to include all beings. There's a move to include Unitarian and Universalist heritages, specifically in our sources, and world religions like Buddhism and Islam. And significantly, a call in 2017 to add an eighth principle, right, which you all have done here, right, which would be explicit about opposing racism, white supremacy, and other oppressions. So, all those changes actually fall in Article 2 of our bylaws, right? That covers that, the principles and the sources, the statement of purpose, the inclusion clause, formerly the non-discrimination clause, and our statement of freedom of conscience. So the board looked at all that, and in the prophetic voice of UUs everywhere said, "We need a committee." Right? They made one. There was suggestions and discussions about size and makeup. They decided on 6. Right? It was a small enough number so that trusting relationships could form and we could schedule meetings. And kind of amazingly, they managed to get in these 6 people both lifelong UUs and UU converts, 3 people of color, 3 LGBTQ people, the organizer of the 8th Principle Project, a religious educator, a minister, the first black woman minister, president of the UU Ministers Association, right? 2 youth members under the age of 18 when they started, and one hillbilly. Now, also this beard can go like prophet or like moonshiner, Moses, Popcorn Sutton, it kind of, but, I'm also a college professor who teaches poetry and helped start the Disability Caucus and, did this stuff on the staff. So, that's how I got on that radar. Even still, we couldn't represent everybody directly. That was never the point, right? It was to get diverse perspectives in that room. And then our job was to talk to people. And so over the next couple of years, we did surveys and workshops at General Assembly and the UU Compass thing and General Assembly again. And, Paula and I put together a series of conversations on covenant and, inspirations and purposes, right, that are up on the Article 2 website or YouTube page. We did surveys and, got roughly 10,000 responses in various ways and formats. And we drew on that. Again, it was that bringing together that collective, what people had said about our shared values and our inspirations and things, and, our individual discernment and our conversations and arguments and disagreements, right? I mean, for me, that was one of the most glorious things about this whole process, is getting to form trusting relationships with people and then have really big arguments about things, right? Where we all were convinced that we were, loving and had everybody's best interest at heart, but we had different perspectives on some of this stuff, right? The value part was kind of easy, right? To answer sort of, we started hearing the same things over and over, right? And so we created a draft, we put that out for feedback, we got feedback, we redrafted it, we presented it to the board in January and to everybody, right? And that's what's on the table. You heard the values and covenant part of it, right? In addition to the purposes and inclusion and freedom of belief. So, and that was our, looking at the changes, looking at how our faith has grown and everything over the past. Well, here's the thing. I wore this shirt today because the last time we made changes to the Article 2, this shirt was in fashion. Right? 1985, and I'm sorry to many of you to have to remind you of this number. 1985 was 38 years ago. 38 years ago, we moved from having 6 principles and purposes to the 7 principles and the sources and all that sort of stuff. Some of those original 6 were kept, some were, abandoned, some were modified, right? I should also point out that these changes happened 10 years before Representative Pearson and Representative Jones were born. They were born in 1995. What's changed in the past 38 years, right? That was the question, what will carry us into this new century? How to renew our faith for the work and the world that lie ahead of us? What will the Unitarian Universalism of our children and our children's children look like? What does the world need us to be? Our faith is congregationalist in polity. Right? The congregations vote on what we do. It's covenantal in practice. We enter into agreements with each other in groups, in congregations, and across the UUA. Article 2 is a covenant between the congregations, which is kind of weird when you think about the fact that people hold the principles very close as a personal statement of ethics. Right? We put it in the walls. There's not a lot of faiths that put their bylaws on the walls of their churches. Right? We have these weird expectations. Right? It's supposed to be a governing document of our association, but it's a statement of theology, it's a statement of ethics. We use it rhetorically in public speaking, engagements and things. We have a lot of expectations out of this. So what we created, is mainly intended to be that covenant between congregations, but we're aware that people are going to look to it for other things too, right? And it made me think about, my wife and I celebrated our 25th anniversary last year, right? And we were going to do a renewal of vows. Right. So here's the problem. We had lost our vows. Right. Of course, we weren't UUs at the time, but we're that type. We wrote our own vows. They were really special. And they're on like a 3.5-inch floppy disk somewhere in our house that we no longer have a machine that will read, right? 1980, So we had to write new ones. But that was great, actually, because any of you all who have been in a long-term relationship, right, we were not the same people as we were 25 years ago when we entered into that relationship, right? The promises we needed to make to each other were entirely different. And some of them, I don't know if we said in sickness and in health back then, but we certainly knew we needed it now, right? It's what happens to us, right? And so, that kind of covenant had to change. And when you think of it like that, people have asked me, well, why are you changing these? Why are you changing these? And if you look at what's happened in the last 38 years, I realized writing this, my question back should have been, well, why should it stay the same? Why do we have this expectation? It's supposed to change every 15 years. The bylaws say we've got to revise it every 15 years at least, right? Because we are a faith that loves change, right? We believe that it is good. It's holy, if you like that, are comfortable with that language, to learn new things, to change the way you see the world, to get good and do good, like James Freeman Clark said in the 19th century. So this is what the Commission's been doing, right? Trying to figure that out, right? So, we kind of ask ourselves, if we were writing Article 2 for the first time now, what would it look like, right? And we started there. And as we went through the process, we added back in some of the language from the principles and things like that, because people really, it felt like they really needed to hear those, even though all our values are coming out of that already anyway. The metaphor I use is we sort of planted the principles and see what grew, right? Which is why I like that flower picture. And that was sent to us, right? A graphic designer noticed that our PowerPoint slides were crappy and said, hey, how about this picture, But yeah, that's what we've got. We know a lot better about how to write a covenant now than we did 40 years ago, I will be honest. There's nothing wrong with the principles, right? And we're not changing them. They just won't be in the bylaws, right? And in a way, it preserves them. You know what I mean? Like, in other words, rather than tinkering and changing and revising and whatever, if you like the principles, if you've got a nice principles poster at home, keep it, use it, That's just not in the bylaws, because Article 2, as it is now, again, I hate to say anything against it, but it doesn't have verbs, right? It says we affirm and promote these principles. Those are not really dynamic verbs, They don't tell you what, and so we thought values, let's name our values. We have these in common. It's clear from our conversations that they overlap for most people. Not every value you have is going to be on the list, but it doesn't need to be, right? Just some shared values that can guide our congregations, right? And our national association, really, not even the individual congregation so much, is how they are together, right? And that values, because we value this, we will do this, right? And so that's why we have structured it the way we structured it, right? The values are broad enough, right, to cover a lot of ground, but still specific enough that we can remember them, right? So it's our attempt to capture, what we've learned of the faith movement in the past 4 decades, I guess, to sum that up. Better ways to express our love, right? People have asked, what's the definition of love? Well, for me, the definition of love is the kind of love that you see refracted through those values. That's the love we're talking about, And it's better way to express that in that covenant. More accepting, more accountable, more forgiving, more anti-racist, anti-homophobic, anti-oppressive in general, more inclusive, more committed to the environment, just more. Like, we can be that faith of more, I think, right? And this is where you come in. If you haven't come in already, right? We're still in this process, right? Tonight is the deadline to submit amendment suggestions, right? And if you hang around after the service, I'll have the URL for that if you want to suggest that. But there are going to be meetings where we're going to try and sort of shape those, because there are a lot of amendments and people, it will be easier to vote on in General Assembly if we work out the language a bit. And then they'll be voted on by all of us at General Assembly. Right. Now, I want to close just by talking about something that happened to me in relationship to the Tennessee Three, right? Which is, I hope you saw Reverend Susan Frederick Gray's statement supporting the Tennessee Three and democratic process, right? But I don't know if you all saw what I saw, but I saw online people saying it was actually democratic, right? It's a democratically elected Republican supermajority. right? The democratically approved Constitution of the state of Tennessee gives them the power to expel members. It was a supermajority vote, right? Like if all you care about is democratic process, that ticked every box. But I'm seeing your reactions. We're like, nah, right? Well, how do we know? What is it that tells us that that's not real democracy? And it's because their justice was not present, right? That there are values that we actually share and understand that tell us what kind of democracy we want, right? And that a democracy that does not seek justice is only going to reinscribe the powers that be, right? So these values, in a way, are more fundamental, I think, than even the principles. They tell us how to interpret these things, how to do these things, right? You heard it earlier. We work to be diverse, multicultural, beloved communities where all thrive. We covenant to dismantle racism and all forms of systemic oppression. We support the use of inclusive democratic processes to make decisions. Inclusive democratic processes under the light of justice, right? We want a just democracy, right? Democracy per se won't save us. You can use that word. I was talking earlier, the Vietnam War ended today, right, years and years ago. That was supposedly to bring democracy to somebody, right? Democracy itself won't save us. Justice-seeking democracy might, right? A democracy that seeks equity, that affirms pluralism, that reflects interdependence, that transforms the world. That kind of democracy would not only resist expelling Justin Jones and Justin Pearson and almost Gloria Johnson, right? That kind of democracy would help bring about a world in which they wouldn't have had to risk their positions for the sake of the beloved community, right? So my appeal is for you all to get involved. I would love it if the delegates from here all voted for it, obviously, but what really matters is that vote, just having that vote, the right kind of vote, right, where people are informed, they understand, they've really thought and discerned, what the changes require of us to become prophets, to understand these changes in the world and us, right? And so, ask yourselves, can this open up a space like I think it can for new energy and new creativity and new connection? Can it build coalitions? I want to be the faith that Representative Jones and Representative Pearson feel safe and comfortable allying with. All right. I want to be the faith, honestly, that deserves my youth, the young adult co-commissioners, Sacha Mamdani and Maya Waller. I want to be a faith that deserves the youth in this church, right? That will be there for them in the way they need it to be, right? And that realizes that prophetic power of all our individual members and the prophecy that comes when we bring that together. I personally would love it if it at least passes this first vote, this majority vote, so that we've got a year to really put it to the test, like I did with that, the justice and democracy thing, right? For me, that was a moment where it really passed that test. But there's lots of stuff. Let's try it out. Try it in RE. See what it enables, right? Can we preach with it? Can we teach with it? Can we march with it? Can we reach out with it? Can we make decisions and connections to other congregations? Can it guide our loving actions? Can it spark new conversations? So what I would really like is for this next year to happen, right? And for us to spend that year together living prophetically. So, thank you. And I will be here for a few minutes in this space after, if you've got questions or you want to talk about things. The Zoom will still be open for all of you on Zoom. Anyway, thank you all. I appreciate it.